Hi, my name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. Authority to create an adaptive organization. I'd like to start off by discussing defantasizing, systemic and sticky change. Probably the most common mistake that I've seen over the decades in the adoption of agile approaches, including Scrum and others, is the mistake in thinking that it's a process or a set of practices. And when that mistake happens, you're not thinking of a systemic change. When you, for example, incorrectly describe Scrum or Agile as a process or a practice, then of course the focus is just here. But consider some of the implications of this. So for example, what we need in an adaptive organization is people focusing on learning new things, becoming multi-skilled and multi-learning. And imagine you go to an organization and you say, Scrum is a process or Agile is a process. And you've got a person on the team who's got a title, business analyst. And they've got a career path from BA1 to BA4, for example. And they might have a performance review once or twice a year to go from BA1 to BA2 and to get more money. And then you go to this person and you say, Scrum, it's a process change. And so what we'd like you to do now, business analyst, is instead of doing business analysis, we encourage you to focus on learning how to program, do UI design, do database design, do architecture, because it's a mindset change. It's a culture change. And you can quickly spot a very naive and inexperienced person if they call something a culture change or a mindset change. Because almost always, people behave according to the system that they find themselves in. This is the basics of human psychology. We're strongly influenced as social primates by the social systems we find ourselves in. And we're extremely influenced by incentives and also threat forces as well. So in the presence of incentives and threat forces, if you just say to that business analyst, oh, it's a mindset change, so why don't you focus on learning about programming now and forget that BA stuff, when in 3 months they're going to have a performance review to go to BA2 with more money, it's a fantasy. And so the most common reason why I see again and again these changes fail is that they're incorrectly described as typically just a set of practices or something like that. And so this talk is called, Do You Have the Authority to Create an Adaptive Organization? And what I typically see is, first of all, people not even recognizing that they can't create an adaptive organization. They don't even recognize that because they incorrectly think the problem is a lack of practices or the problem is just a new process. And therefore, by adopting practices or processes will fix the problem rather than it being systemic. And as this classic star model from Galbraith illustrates, all of these things are connected to each other. So in the context of Scrum, which is truly a systemic change, then to think that you can just change one of these things and have an adaptive organization is unskillful. It doesn't recognize what's needed. It's going to have to involve people changes in roles and responsibilities. It's going to have to involve reward changes. So the career path is not for being a single specialist like a BA, but for multi-learning and multi-skills. It's going to involve structure changes because if there's no longer a business analysis career path and business analysis, then there's no longer a business analysis group and no longer a BA manager. And that implies the end of all of the single function departments as well. And ultimately, that influences strategy because with a truly adaptive organization, you can switch from plan, execute to explore, discover, and try to develop areas where you think you've got ROI based upon learning rather than based upon planning and predicting. So this is, I think, pretty obvious, but I've noticed it needs to be spelled out. So the many changes that I've seen, and this is almost always in the large-scale context, which is why it's my focus. The most common situation I see is that there's these changes for Scrum or Agile introduced, and they're merely practice and process changes rather than systemic changes. And then as a result, not very effective. They don't actually make the impact for adaptiveness that's wanted. They won't last very long because then someone else will come along with new practices and new processes and replace the old ones. And last but not least, it can create negative side effects. And I want to linger on this for a moment. I sometimes see young or inexperienced change coaches come into an organization and they'll have the mindset of, well, we can introduce fake change and that's better than nothing. And again, I see coaches or scrum masters in organizations, they see the reality that there's no ability to change all of this stuff. They're just lost in their little local optimizations of being able to change practices. And then they say, well, let's try to introduce Scrum in this limited context. It can't have any harm to do that. But the problem is that I've noticed that when you introduce fake change, where everyone can see it's not the real thing, then what happens is that it destabilizes the existing status quo organizational system. And that system might have kind of sucked. It might not be very good, but at least we know how it's running, and we can kind of identify where its weaknesses are and how we might be able to improve them a little bit. But then what happens is you get these enthusiastic coaches, but naive, who come in and say, well, let's introduce these changes, and we can't introduce the real change because we don't have any authority to do that, but we'll just change the practices a little bit. And then the consequence of that is often that things get worse. They temporarily might look like they're getting a little bit better, but then eventually everything starts to get destabilized. And this might take 1-2 years after the initial kind of shallow or fake change is introduced. And then what happens is that the business people who were sold the message that this is going to really revolutionize and make everything better, they realize that this is the 15th time they've heard this from the IT CIO over the last 25 years. This is the 15th change fad that's been promised to revolutionize something, and it never does. They see this. They see that the old organization is destabilized. Things are actually worse than before because the introduction of some of these practices tends to provoke seeing the problems more, which is a good thing if you would actually resolve the problems. But because a lot of the root causes of the problems are not in practices, but in the organizational design, and because there is no one with authority to fix the root cause problems, then they just remain and linger and so forth. And consequently, the senior business people go, yet another fad, and they lose trust yet again in the software group. Product management loses trust in the software group. The best people in the organization, in the software development organization, might start to leave because they've often got more opportunities. The people who are really enthusiastic and kind of the dreamers, the scrum masters and the other people that really care about change and want to make a better future and are really optimistic, they start to get depressed. They start to see, oh, crap, none of this is really working out, and I don't have the support I thought I was going to get, and on, and they become depressed or they leave the company. And it would have been better off just to leave the thing alone in its current state. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that if you don't have the authority to create an adaptive organization, you go in naively misunderstanding what's required, and you just focus on superficial processes and practice changes. All of this can destabilize and make things worse than it was in the original case. And so I encourage people to be a little bit more cautious about their promotion of what change is going to introduce. That's why, well, I've just talked about the naive mistake of local optimization improvement that will lead to better things. That's why in the laws of systems thinking, which are really wonderful, and I do recommend people read the book, The Fifth Discipline. I think I've read it 3 times now over the last 20 years, and it's the only nonfiction book that I've read more than once, and I'll probably read it a 4th time. Every 5 years or so I get something different out of it, and a lot of other people do as well. That's why one of the laws is the cure can be worse than disease. The introduction of change ideas, when they're not really understood, and the people introducing these changes don't have the authority to actually follow through on the implications of the change. So this opening section of this presentation is about defantasizing the fantasy that deep and meaningful change will happen with only process or practice change. By the way, this day is called Less Talk, and you'll see that this talk will end relatively soon, and then we're going to go into an exercise. So to conclude, what kind of authority do you need for an adaptive organization? You need authority across all of these elements. You need to be able to have full control over the organizational design, its choice of career paths, reward systems, processes, group structures, site structures, strategy, and policies, something that I would have included in my taxonomy of org design if I was creating this. This classic STAR model comes from Galbraith. I think the one thing he left out, which I would have elevated to a first-class thing, is policies. But that's not the main point. The main point is you need control over all of this stuff if you actually want to make an adaptive change successfully. And then to repeat, if you don't have that control and you try to introduce this in a shallow way, there can be more harm than benefit. Don't naively assume that it won't have side effects. But now let's move on to the second part of the talk, now that I've laid the ground of defantasizing and what preconditions are necessary. So for deep change, you need full control over this, or another possible option is what in English is sometimes called hacking your bureaucracy. And hacking the bureaucracy is not a guaranteed solution, but in Steve Covey's circles of control model, circle of control, circle of influence, circle of concern, the idea with hack the bureaucracy is to focus on the circle of concern and the circle of influence, areas where traditionally people are encouraged to not spend their time. But this idea is that this is indeed where you spend your time. So a few thoughts about hacking your bureaucracy. And my overarching point, and this is something that my friend and colleague and the co-creator of LeSS, Bas Vodde, always encourages, is this can-do attitude over can't-do attitude. Both of us are much more interested in making progress where we can in organizations rather than where we can't, while at the same time remembering what I just said about the naive change influences, that naive change can actually be harmful. So this isn't, I'm just not suggesting to do whatever you can, but to do so with insight. I'll give you some examples. I've worked a lot in financial services, in investment banking, for example, and every once in a while, I used to hear a statement like, you can't do that here because it's not allowed by the financial laws. And then they would say Sarbanes-Oxley or Dodd-Frank or Basel II or something like that. And so one of the tips that I've learned from this is that whenever you hear some variation of this, ask for the law. This is the Sarbanes-Oxley law. And you can do this with Basel II or Dodd-Frank or whatever. And for example, I remember I was at a bank once where they said, oh, all the programmers have to have their code in separate repositories. Every component needs a separate repository. And I said, oh, why is that? Oh, because it's the financial law. We're required to do that by law. You can do this with virtually anything that you hear from somebody who says that we can't do this because of some law. I have yet to find a case where that was true in a single business that I've worked in. And what typically happens, and so I've made a hobby for myself when I hear this to find out the history of how this happened in their company, and encourage you to do that as well, and then to share these stories to start to unpack or reveal the illusions that people are under. So for example, what typically happens, at least in Canada where I'm from and the United States, is you've got these consulting companies like Accenture, or, well, Accenture will do as an example, although I'm not trying to pick on them, or McKinsey or whatever. And they hire, this is the key point, they hire graduates with degrees in geography or French literature or 14th century European history. And by the way, I love all of these subjects, don't get me wrong. They're wonderful subjects. But these are 24-year-old children without any work experience in software development. And then they get hired as McKinsey consultants with a master's degree in 14th century European history. And then they get onto the Sarbanes-Oxley regulation adoption at Bank of America or whatever. And they read this stuff. They ask their older colleagues at McKinsey, well, what do we have to write? And boils down to this: you make stuff up that conforms to what other people believe at the moment, got nothing to do with the law, and you write that down, and then you say to the CEO of the bank, this is the adoption of Sarbanes-Oxley in the bank. This is the legally correct adoption. And all of this stuff is just made up. And if you go into the banks and find these regulatory documents which are claimed to be driven by the law, there's no relationship, or the relationship is the most vague and obscure relationship that you can find. And so this is true of a lot of bureaucratic elements, that when you unpack them, you can reveal that it's a kind of a house of cards. And especially if you can do this in a way that people aren't defensive, but become amused, you can often then create allies for this and then start to hack the bureaucracy. There's no time to meet with our CEO for this important org design change. The senior management aren't interested in paying attention. I've heard this before. You've probably heard this as well. Ken Schwaber, the creator of modern Scrum, used to tell the story of working at a company once where he had heard this and he wasn't able to connect with the CEO directly. He went to the CEO's office and was able to get permission to drive home with the CEO. I'd never met the CEO, but it was like a 45-minute drive, set up the discussion with the CEO, explained, I want to talk with you about software development in our company. I'm a consultant here, blah, blah, blah. And then he was able to have a 45-minute ride home and then took a taxi back to his place with the CEO in order to have an in-depth conversation about the ideas and the changes that he was suggesting. And this made quite an impact in what he was able to do in the company. And it yet again show the kind of circles of influence and circles of concern that we can actually take action in if we have initiative. Another example of hacking your bureaucracy and taking initiative in areas where you might not think. Notice in our first book, the organization of the first major section is thinking tools. And if you didn't know why, it's because we were trying to communicate that the biggest ideas and less are not the organizational design tools and the action tools, but it's really the thinking tools. We're trying to encourage people to shift to first principles thinking, queuing theory, systems thinking, human psychology, and so forth, rather than at the level of adopting an org design or adopting a framework. And so there's a lot that we can do in terms of hacking the bureaucracy by educating people at this level, and then the slow but steady influences that this can have. And so I tend to encourage people educating at this level. I'll give you a more recent example then from this. I've just come from Finland, and I spent 5 days with the CXO team of a large telecom service provider, and also several days with the C-1 team. And how did I get in a room for 8 hours a day with the entire CXO, the CEO, CFO, and so on and so forth? Well, about a year or so ago, a Scrum Master from this company came to my course, and he had the impression, which I agree with, that senior management need to become educated in this. But instead of him just saying, not going to be able to possible, so what can we do with plan B, he actually took the time to think like a politician, to work through all of the various political pathways until ultimately he was able to get the senior management to engage in actually doing some learning with a long, slow, hacking the bureaucracy process. And then that's now going to lead to a quite significant change in this organization now that the CXO is on board. Another example of things that you can do to become more empowered, your circles of influence, which is, I'm sure many of you are now familiar with systems modeling, and in your companies you could go back and offer a 2-hour systems modeling workshop with anybody, anyone from the CXO to HR to you name it. And these seeds of education can be more influential than you might think to begin with. Other examples of hacking the organization are found in this chapter of our first book, and also in experiments of our second book, and in some of the guides of the third book. And I know you probably can't read the text, that's not important, but in the organization chapter, I'm highlighting here various experiments which don't involve strong authority, which was the opening point of this talk, the need for having strong authority across the whole organizational design to make a deep change. These are examples of hacking the bureaucracy without that. To show you in a larger picture, please read this. I'm not going to waste your time by repeating what you can read in the book, etc. But as an example, years ago, Bas Vodde was a manager in Nokia Networks, and he had some people reporting to him, and he was forced by Nokia Networks to do annual performance reviews for the people reporting to him. Now, Bas understands that this is largely just a useless, wasteful activity, but he asked, so this was fill in the forms, he asked himself, how can I hack the bureaucracy to make this more useful? So what he agreed was, with the people that were reporting to him, at the beginning of the year, he would ask them what books they would like to read. And then he said, we're going to have to meet in 6 months for your performance review. If you could come back in 6 months and then tell me what was good in the books, then that's all that we need to do. And so Bas used it as a way to get other people to read books so he could get the summaries. and everybody got to learn more. And so it was a way in which, it didn't create too much harm in the organization, but it worked within the existing bureaucracy, but kind of hacking it at the same time. So this is once again all examples of can do over can't do. A recent book on this subject, which I heartily recommend, is called Hack Your Bureaucracy. Marina Nitze is a hands-on programmer. She started at 12 years old making commercial websites for celebrities, and so she understands programming. And by the time she was, I think, 28 years old, she was the CTO of the United States Veteran Affairs Organization department in the federal government, which is a multi-billion-dollar department. And she's worked in a number of different large organizations, and because she comes to the work very much as an entrepreneur and as a developer, the stories are relevant for all of us to learn because she comes from that mindset, which is what we're familiar with. And her stories are largely in the context of software development and IT, making them sort of doubly relevant. Once again, I'm not going to waste your time by telling you what you could learn by reading the book. I encourage you to get it. I think there's an audiobook version. It's divided into some major sections, with each of which has 10 or so different hacks. Please read this list if you can. Wonderful names of some of these tips. Stab people in the chest instead of in the back. Use the bureaucracy against itself. It's full of real clever, real-world hacks from a person with a developer background trying to hack IT organizations and large bureaucratic groups and making success with that. And so I encourage all of us with a can-do attitude to steal these ideas and apply as many of them as we can. And then maybe, ultimately, being able to eventually get control over the org design elements and truly being able to then have the authority to make an adaptive organization.